What if the most powerful force shaping your life right now is something you will never notice? Not because it's hidden, but because it feels exactly like your own thinking. Stay with me on that, because what you're about to hear changed how I understand attention, control, and what it actually means to see clearly. And the strangest part is, it didn't come from a laboratory or a sacred text. It came from two people who simply stopped looking away. Leora never said it happened suddenly. And that detail matters more than you might think. She always framed it as something that unfolded while she was living an ordinary life, walking familiar streets, answering messages, moving through days that looked identical to everyone else's. What changed wasn't the world. It was her relationship to what she had been trained not to notice. And if that distinction doesn't unsettle you a little, it should, because it implies something uncomfortable, that there are things operating in plain sight that most of us have agreed, without realizing it, to ignore. She described the moment as an ascent, not upward through space, but inward through layers of attention. Nothing dramatic at first, just a subtle realization that some forces don't hide by disappearing. They hide by remaining obvious and unexamined. Think about that for a moment. The best hiding place isn't darkness, it's normalcy. She explained it with a calm that made people lean in. If something wants to control behavior, it doesn't announce itself. It blends into habit. It borrows language you already trust. It adopts the tone of common sense. Leora said, "The greatest advantage any unseen system has is not power, but familiarity. When something feels normal, the mind stops questioning it. And once questioning stops, perception narrows. That narrowing is the doorway." Her ascent vision didn't involve lights or voices. It came as a widening. She noticed how her attention had been guided for years, pulled toward urgency, toward fear, toward endless internal commentary. None of that was accidental. Not engineered in a sci-fi sense, but shaped slowly, culturally, psychologically. The forces she spoke about didn't need to be supernatural to be effective. They only needed to remain unnamed, unseen, unchallenged. She said, "Invisibility isn't about being hidden. It's about being filtered out. The human mind is constantly discarding information to function. That filtering keeps us sane, but it can also be used against us. If something positions itself just outside the range of what we're taught to pay attention to, it gains freedom. It can influence mood, reaction, even belief, without ever appearing as a clear object of awareness. If you're listening to this right now, and something in you just tightened, that's not a coincidence. That tightening is exactly the mechanism she's describing, the filter activating, the narrowing beginning. She said that's when she understood why invisibility is the preferred state. Anything visible can be confronted, anything named can be questioned, anything clearly perceived can be resisted. But something that operates through your own inner voice, your own habits, your own assumptions, that's almost impossible to fight. Because you don't experience it as other, you experience it as yourself. The ascent vision showed her a pattern repeated across history. Whenever people began to see clearly, systems shifted tactics. When control through force failed, control through belief took over. When belief was questioned, control through distraction replaced it. Each layer more subtle than the last, each one less visible. And the final stage? It wasn't oppression, it was noise. Endless stimulation that prevented stillness long enough for recognition to occur. She spoke gently about this, never accusing, never dramatic. That tone was intentional. Fear sharpens the filter, calm softens it. She wanted listeners to feel safe enough to notice themselves. She'd say, if something benefits from you, never slowing down, never resting your attention, never sitting quietly with your own awareness, that tells you something. Now, here's what made Leora's understanding different from conspiracy or paranoia. The unseen forces she referred to didn't mind being discussed as myths or metaphors. What they avoided was direct observation, The kind that happens when someone stops reacting automatically. When someone pauses between stimulus and response. That pause, she said, is where invisibility collapses. Not because the force disappears, but because it loses its cover. She described realizing that many ancient warnings weren't about monsters or external enemies. They were about perception itself, about guarding the inner gate, about learning to recognize what doesn't feel hostile, but feels subtly diminishing. The ascent vision didn't elevate her above others. It made her more ordinary, more grounded, more attentive. She laughed more, reacted less. That was the real sign. If you're waiting for the dramatic revelation in this story, you'll keep waiting, and that's the lesson. Because Leora said that once you understand invisibility as a strategy, you stop looking for dramatic revelations. You stop expecting thunder. You start noticing patterns, repetition, emotional loops that don't resolve, thoughts that discourage curiosity, a constant pull toward distraction right before insight. These aren't proof of anything mystical on their own. They're indicators, signals that attention is being steered. She emphasized that nothing needed to be fought. Fighting feeds visibility back into the system it opposes. The unseen doesn't want resistance. It wants engagement, outrage, endless commentary. The real shift came when she stopped feeding it energy altogether. When she noticed, acknowledged, and then returned to presence. Over time, what once felt heavy became thin. What once felt powerful became predictable. The ascent vision ended not with answers, but with responsibility. Seeing wasn't the finish line. It was the beginning of a different way of moving through the world, one where she could no longer pretend ignorance, one where she had to choose clarity over comfort, again and again, not loudly, quietly. In small moments no one else would ever notice. She told her story not to convince, but to offer a mirror. If anything in it resonated, she said that wasn't because of her. It was because part of you already knows how invisibility works, already senses when something is off, already feels the relief that comes with slowing down and seeing what's actually there. And she always ended this part the same way, with a half smile. The most powerful thing you can do to an unseen system is notice it without fear, without drama, and without giving it a name it can hide behind. But here's what Leora could describe. She couldn't teach directly. That's where Elias came in. And his approach was so simple, it almost felt like a trick. Elias never framed what he taught as a technique in the usual sense. He disliked that word because it implied effort, strain, and a goal to be achieved. What he described instead was a relearning, an undoing of habits the mind had accumulated in order to survive a loud world. He said, most people believe seeing is passive, that perception simply happens. But perception, he explained, is trained. And like any training, it can be narrowed or expanded depending on what is rewarded. He would ask people to remember how they look when they're anxious. The eyes tighten, the focus becomes sharp and narrow, attention locks onto a problem and excludes everything else. That state is useful for emergencies, but destructive when it becomes permanent. If you're being honest with yourself right now, you probably recognize this state. Most of us live in it, not because we're broken, but because the world has trained us to stay there. Over time, the brain learns to stay contracted. It filters aggressively. Anything that doesn't serve immediate function is discarded before it reaches awareness. That includes subtle emotional shifts, environmental cues, and inner signals that something is misaligned. Elias called this the default tunnel. Not a mystical concept, just a description of how attention collapses under pressure. He said that whatever operates invisibly relies on this tunnel remaining intact. As long as perception stays narrow, influence can move freely around its edges, not because people are weak, but because they're overloaded. Training the eyes to notice wasn't about seeing strange things. It was about widening the frame. He taught people to soften their gaze, literally and mentally. When the eyes relax, the nervous system follows. Peripheral vision activates. You begin to notice motion, contrast, and presence without chasing it. The world stops feeling like a series of threats and starts feeling like a field. He often demonstrated this by asking someone to stare at a single point on the wall, then, without moving their eyes, to notice what else was visible. At first, they'd name obvious objects, then shadows, then subtle changes in light. Finally, sensations, breath, posture, internal tone. He'd say, nothing new appeared. It was always there. You just stopped excluding it. You can try this yourself right now. Soften your gaze. Stop gripping whatever thought you're holding. Notice how much more appears when you stop demanding that attention stay fixed. Elias believed the same principle applied inwardly. Thoughts that dominate awareness aren't necessarily the most important ones. They're simply the loudest. When attention softens, quieter signals emerge. Intuition doesn't shout, it nudges. But nudges are missed when the mind is clenched. He warned that the moment someone begins this practice, resistance often appears, not externally, internally, boredom, restlessness, a sudden urge to check something, to move, to think about something else. He didn't interpret this as failure. He saw it as confirmation. The filter was being challenged, and the system, psychological, cultural, habitual, was pushing back to restore normal narrowing. If you've ever tried to meditate and felt an almost unbearable urge to quit after 30 seconds, you've met this resistance. It's not weakness, it's the tunnel defending itself. He encouraged people not to fight that resistance. Fighting re-engages the same sharp focus that created the tunnel in the first place. Instead, he suggested curiosity. Interesting, he'd say. Notice how quickly attention wants to escape. That noticing alone begins to loosen the grip. One of his core ideas was that attention is food. Whatever receives it grows more solid. Thoughts, emotions, even moods become more convincing when constantly observed with tension. When attention relaxes, these constructs lose density. They don't disappear instantly, but they stop dominating. Elias spoke often about the myth of constant clarity. He said, clarity comes in waves. You see a little more, then the old filters return. That's normal. The mistake is believing that seeing once means seeing forever. The practice is gentle repetition, returning to softness, returning to peripheral awareness, again and again. He also emphasized embodiment. Noticing wasn't just visual or mental, it involved the whole body, the way the feet meet the ground, the way the jaw holds tension, the way breath changes when a difficult thought arises. These physical cues are faster than conscious interpretation. They tell the truth before the mind explains it away. Over time, students noticed changes, not visions, not revelations, but space. Situations that once triggered immediate reaction now had a pause. In that pause, choice appeared. The choice to respond differently, or not at all. Elias said this was the real training, not seeing hidden forces, but reclaiming agency over attention. He was careful not to encourage paranoia. He warned that once people realize influence exists, they can begin seeing it everywhere. That's just another form of tunnel vision. The goal wasn't suspicion, it was clarity. A grounded awareness that can include uncertainty without filling it with stories. Elias often reminded people that the most effective filters are the ones we defend. Beliefs we've invested in emotionally resist examination. When attention softens, those beliefs may wobble. That can feel destabilizing. He reassured them that nothing essential would be lost, only what depended on tension to survive. He described the process as adjusting a lens rather than opening a door. You're not entering a new world. You're seeing this one more accurately. The unseen doesn't rush forward dramatically when noticed. It simply becomes less influential. Like a background hum, you finally realize you can turn down. By the end of his sessions, people didn't feel special. They felt quieter, more present, less compelled to react. Elias considered that success. He said, "The clearest sign that perception is widening is an increased tolerance for silence. Silence internally and externally. The ability to be with experience without immediately labeling it." He concluded that training the eyes to notice isn't about acquiring hidden knowledge. It's about removing unnecessary filters. What remains is simple, ordinary, and surprisingly sufficient. When attention is no longer hijacked, invisibility loses its advantage, not because it's exposed, but because it's no longer needed to explain anything. So, let me ask you something directly. How much of your day is spent reacting to things that, when you step back, didn't actually require a reaction? How many of your strongest opinions were formed, not through thought, but through repetition? If those questions make you uncomfortable, that discomfort is useful. It means the tunnel is being noticed. Now here's where Leora and Elias converged, and where the story becomes yours. After a while, seeing stopped feeling like an event and started feeling like a condition. That was the change neither Leora nor Elias could fully prepare people for. Once perception widened enough, it didn't snap back completely. The old tunnel still appeared under stress, but it no longer felt like home. And that difference altered how life unfolded in small, cumulative ways. People who had practiced noticing began to report similar shifts. Conversations changed first, not dramatically, but subtly. They spoke less to fill space and more to respond. Silence no longer felt threatening. When someone projected fear or urgency, it didn't automatically hook them. They could feel the pull and choose not to follow it. Elias said this was where things became practical. Seeing wasn't about decoding symbols or identifying hidden actors. It was about pattern recognition. You begin to notice when interactions repeat the same emotional loop, when media cycles provoke the same reactions, when internal narratives arise right before rest, clarity, or contentment. Ask yourself honestly, when was the last time you felt genuinely peaceful and something, a notification, a worry, a thought, appeared to pull you away from it? If that pattern sounds familiar, you're already seeing what Leora and Elias described. These patterns stop feeling personal. They start feeling mechanical. Once that happens, blame dissolves. There's nothing to fight, no enemy to defeat, just feedback loops to step out of. Stepping out doesn't require effort, only non-participation. When you don't feed a loop with attention, it weakens. When enough people do this, systems based on constant engagement struggle to maintain coherence. Leora talked about boundaries, but not in the way people expect, not walls, not shields. She meant something simpler, naming what you will not carry. She encouraged quiet declarations, not spoken aloud, not performed, just internally recognized. This reaction isn't mine. This urgency doesn't belong to this moment. The mistake most people make is waiting for permission to trust their own perception. They want someone, an expert, a teacher, a study, to confirm what they already feel. But Leora said something important shifted when people stopped demanding proof. Proof is a public language. Seeing is private. When you insist on external validation, you hand authority back to the very filters you're trying to loosen. The confidence that grows from perception is quiet. It doesn't argue. Over time, people noticed that the unseen lost its drama. What once felt ominous became boring, predictable, the same tactics, the same distractions, the same emotional bait. When something becomes boring, it loses power. Fear requires novelty. Influence requires engagement. Without those, it fades into background noise. Public sightings increased, not of entities, but of behavior. Mass reactions that moved too fast, outrage that appeared fully formed, trends that vanished as quickly as they arose. Instead of being pulled in, observers could watch these waves pass through society, not detached, just unhooked. Elias emphasized that this wasn't withdrawal from life. Quite the opposite. People became more responsive, more humane. When attention wasn't constantly hijacked, empathy increased. They could listen without preparing a response, act without performing, rest without guilt. These were not mystical achievements. They were signs of nervous systems returning to baseline. One of the most unexpected changes was humor. People laughed more easily, at themselves, at the predictability of certain thoughts. Humor, Elias said, is incompatible with domination. Anything that can be laughed at has already lost its grip. The unseen prefers solemnity, heavy meaning, constant seriousness. Laughter collapses that structure instantly. If you apply nothing else from this, apply that. The next time you catch yourself spiraling into seriousness about something that doesn't truly matter, laugh, not to dismiss it, but to remind yourself that you have a choice in how tightly you hold it. Leora noticed that as people stabilized in this way, they stopped seeking constant teaching. They didn't need new frameworks. They trusted their own noticing. That was the final shift. When perception becomes self-validating, external authority loses its hold. Guidance can still be appreciated, but it's no longer required. She was clear that nothing here created superiority. Seeing didn't make someone better. It made them less reactive, less certain, more flexible. Those qualities don't dominate, they coexist. That's why they're difficult to control. The most important outcome, she said, was simplicity. Life didn't become more complex with layers of hidden meaning. It became cleaner, less crowded internally. When attention rests naturally, many problems resolve themselves, or reveal that they were never problems to begin with. In the end, what changed wasn't the world structure, but one's relationship to it. The unseen didn't vanish. It just stopped being central. Like stagehands once the spotlight moves, still there, still working, but no longer mistaken for the show itself. And that, according to both Leora and Elias, was enough. Before you go, let me leave you with this. Nothing you've heard here is meant to replace your own experience. If something resonated, sit with it quietly. Don't rush to label it. Don't rush to share it. Let it integrate at its own pace. Real understanding doesn't announce itself. It settles in gently and changes how you move through ordinary moments. Here's one thing you can do right now. Tonight, before you sleep, sit for 2 minutes without reaching for your phone. Notice what arises, notice the pull, and instead of following it, just watch. That's the practice. That's where it begins. If this perspective gave you a pause you don't usually get on this platform, that matters. If it helped you notice your own attention, even briefly, that matters more. These conversations survive because people engage with them thoughtfully, not because they go viral. If you want to support this work, subscribe so these explorations can continue without distortion. If the video grounded you, leave a like. It helps signal that calm content still has a place here. And if you know someone who enjoys thinking slowly and deeply, share this with them in a quiet way. And one last thing, if you made it this far, you already have the capacity for the kind of attention Leora and Elias described. Most people would have scrolled away minutes ago. The fact that you didn't tells you something about yourself. Trust that. Thanks for spending this time with me. Stay curious, stay present, and I'll see you in the next one.